Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the New Testament half of Disciple 1 FastTrack. So welcome back to Wesley Wednesday. I hope that you all got a chance to view the video that I had sent out last week. That was a fun video to do, but the long and short of that was just to talk about how the New Testament came to be, why the books that are in it, and the criteria for how the church discerned what books we now receive today as Scripture. So if you haven't gotten a chance to look through that, it's on Facebook, it's on YouTube, it's on wesleyfreedom.org/disciple. I do want all of you to know the website wesleyfreedom.org/disciple. That's where all of these lectures are going to be posted. That's where all of the Old Testament lectures are currently posted. So that's, if you ever miss a day because of COVID or you're out of town, we can't recreate the discussion, obviously, but these lectures will be preserved until YouTube fails. So you will be able to go back and rewatch these. So where I want to start today, before we get into Matthew's Gospel, which is the reading that was assigned for this week, is just to give a little background on the New Testament world, so what is the setting that we're in, and a little bit about the idea of gospel as a genre. So in the world of the New Testament, we are looking at the Roman-controlled Mediterranean. That's where the New Testament is taking place. And specifically, we're talking about a Jewish group within the wider Hellenistic culture. And Hellenism refers to the Greek culture that Alexander the Great's conquest spread in the 4th century BC. So when Alexander the Great spread his empire, that brought Greek culture, the Greek language, Greek religion, Greek polytheism, and spread it around the Mediterranean. While Aramaic in the 1st century was the spoken language of Roman Palestine, so Aramaic would have been what Jesus and the disciples had as their first tongue, and they would have known Hebrew as their sacred language, the language of their scriptural text. Greek was the international language of business and learning. Greek is the language that all of the New Testament books are originally written in. So that means that these are written for an audience of persons who had some level of literacy. So if you were taught to read and write, you would have been taught Greek. Within the Greek world, life was centered in the city, or the polis. And why this is important is that among the Gentiles, even if they lived in the countryside, it was the city that was the source for civic life, markets, and religious rituals. And so the cities become the center of Hellenistic society. This is important because it carries over into the missionary activity of the early Christians. Christianity would follow this Hellenistic model and establish their major churches in the cities. So you would have a bishop of a city. And we still follow this model today, right? The dioceses and churches that have dioceses, it's the Diocese of Washington, the Diocese of Baltimore, and then that bishop is the head pastor for all of the churches in that area. Even in our own church, we have the Baltimore-Washington Conference. That's where our bishop is the head pastor. Obviously, that covers all of D.C. and the vast majority of Maryland, not just the cities of Baltimore and Washington. But Hellenistic culture and Christianity is first an urban religion. So it is centered in city life, people close together, and very diverse people close together. So just as you're thinking through some of the issues that are going to be arising for the early Christian church and a lot of the audience for these Gospels, these are people in cities, people who are living with a whole lot of people who are very different from them. Within the world, like we said, Rome was the ruling empire at the time of the New Testament's composition and for hundreds of years after the New Testament's composition. What we want to understand about Rome is that Rome had a shifting relationship with Christianity over time, right? Obviously, eventually Christianity would become the state religion of the Roman Empire, but there were times of persecution and times of apathy within that. And just to give you a sense of why that is, Rome, like large empires before it, was largely tolerant of local customs, local religions, so long as those people paid their taxes and made sacrifices to the emperor as a god. So you could do whatever you want in addition to that, but Rome was going to leave you alone if you gave them their money and worshiped the emperor as a god. Now, Judaism was given a special dispensation from worshiping the emperor as a god because Judaism, as a faith and as a people, was older than Rome. And here's why that matters. In Roman culture, there was something called the mos maiorum, which it was kind of an unwritten social code. It kind of means the way of the ancestors, the way of the majority, the dead majority. And the idea of the mos maiorum is that if something was old and had lasted, then it was worthy of honor. You have to understand, Rome was an inherently conservative culture. Conservative in the sense that if something was old and ancient and revered and it worked, then they weren't going to touch it. They were going to assume that that was good. And so the fact that Judaism was an ancient religion that had lasted meant that they got a lot of leeway from Rome because they were so old. Now, this is going to foreshadow some of the Christian relations with Rome. Namely, that in the beginning, when Christianity was seen as one movement within Judaism, they were not specifically persecuted by the Roman Empire. There were certain Christians, when they got vocal and criticized Roman officials and spoke out openly against the empire, they were executed, right? That's why all of the apostles, except for St. John, ended up being executed by Rome, right? It's because they were vocal, they were outspoken, they were encouraging not just Jews but Gentiles to stop their worship of the emperor as a god. But for the majority of Christians early on, Rome just kind of left them alone because they were Jews. They were doing Jewish things. It was an issue when Christianity shifted from being basically a sect of Judaism into being a majority Gentile movement, when it was more clearly defined as no longer part of Judaism. Because now Christianity is not something old, now it's something new. It was one of those superstitions from the East, right, that has arisen in Roman minds. And so now, this is something new that's telling people to not worship the emperor. Well, that's a problem. And so you see, even over the course of the New Testament, in some of the earliest things written, so in Paul's letters, right, there's not a huge animosity towards the Romans. Clearly, he is monotheistic, right? There's no room for offering sacrifices or offering food to the emperor or to pagan gods. where there's not overt hostility. Even in the Gospels, we know that Christ was executed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. We know from historical sources that Pilate was actually recalled to Rome because he was so brutal. But you notice that even the Gospels don't villainize Pilate, right? At the time the Gospels were written, there was not a strict differentiation between Christianity and Judaism. And so you see the way that they consider that internal conflict to be much more important, right? You see a lot more between Jesus and the Sanhedrin, Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees than you do between Jesus and Pilate in terms of where the gospel authors are having their focus. So you see the kind of the way it's going in their minds. The Romans are just kind of there. Now, notice as the New Testament progresses, how much more Rome ends up getting vilified because Christianity is now beginning to become its own thing. Rome is beginning to persecute Christians more. So by the time you get the book of Revelation written, Rome is the great beast, right? The whore of Babylon is Rome. And so by the time you get there, when Rome is actively trying to suppress Christianity, then they're no longer just kind of a neutral pagan force. They are, the direct servant of the devil. So you see the progression there and why, as Christianity develops from something in the Roman mind, part of something old to something new, that relationship changes drastically. Okay, let's think about Judaism at the time of Jesus. The commentary in your workbook actually does a great job on page 10 of separating out some of the major players within Judaism at this time. But the two that I want to highlight are the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the aristocrats, the temple leadership. Theologically, they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. So for the Sadducees, they're following that Old Testament tradition where when you're dead, you're dead. You're in the ground, you're done. The idea was that you followed God's law in this life or prosperity in this life, and then your life was over. Just know that when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, this group basically disappears. Their livelihood was so connected to the temple that without the temple, they lost their place in society. The other group that becomes important for us in reading the New Testament are the Pharisees. So the Pharisees are not priests, they're lay people who were the teachers in the synagogues. So they were highly educated, but they were not tied to temple worship, they were tied to synagogue worship. The Pharisees followed the Old Testament tradition of believing in a resurrection of the dead. So if you took the Old Testament course, just remember there are lots of opinions that are put together in the Old Testament. Multiple points of view are included. So one point of view was when you're dead, you're dead. The other point of view is when you're dead, but at the end of time there will be a general resurrection. The Pharisees fall in that latter category. So this is why we would say that Jesus would have been seen by the Jews of his day and by his first followers as a Pharisee, right? So just keep in mind that as you read the debates between Jesus and the Pharisees, that is an internal fight. That is a fight between people that are in the same broad Jewish mindset. So both Christianity and modern rabbinic Judaism trace their theological roots to the Pharisees of the first century, right? And this is even highlighted more because Paul, who was probably the first major theologian of Christianity, was a trained Pharisee. So a lot of Christian thought is rooted in Pharisaic thought that then recognizes Jesus as God. So Christianity is Pharisees who think Jesus is God. Modern Judaism are Pharisees who think Jesus is not God. But both Christianity and Judaism are the descendants of first century Pharisees. All of the other groups at that time largely died off. The Essenes died off, the Zealots died off, the Sadducees died off. Okay, shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about the Gospels as a literary genre, right? Because we have 4 of them. And we also have, later on, works that are called Gospels, but were written 200-300 years after Jesus was dead, telling different stories. I talked about that a little bit in the last lecture, that these were usually written by the pagan hybrid Christian group called the Gnostics. But it shows that by that time, the idea of a gospel had become a kind of thing you could write. But that wasn't always the case. The word gospel literally just means good news. So this is the good news. It was used in the ancient world to describe announcements, right? So a Roman victory in battle. Hear the good news. Hear the gospel. We won. Births of royals, coronations, and other official proclamations were titled the good news, the gospel. We know very early on from Paul's letters that Christians used the term gospel to describe the message about Jesus, that he was God and man, he died for us and rose, that we have forgiveness and union with God, right? That was the gospel. Mark includes the good news of Jesus Christ as part of the title, as part of the introduction to his writing. Mark was the first of what we have called the Gospels in our New Testament to be written down. And so he sets this pace. And so because Mark, as the first gospel to be written down, says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, all of those other 3 books that seem to be doing a similar thing to what Mark was doing, we call gospels because Mark used it in his introduction. Does that make sense? Okay. So, like I said, the idea of a gospel as a literary genre, not just an announcement, but a kind of thing you can write, was invented by Mark. So, while biographies in the modern sense are, modern, there was an ancient genre called a bios that was well known, and a bios would have presented the life of a subject according to a certain type or ideal model. So you wouldn't be exploring their childhood and their motivations and their influences. You would say, this person is a general, so I'm going to write him in accordance with the archetypal general. Or this person was a philosopher, so I'm going to present him in accordance with the archetype of what a philosopher should be. And writing the life of someone was to show everybody that they were that kind of person. So as we read the Gospels, each writer is presenting the story of Jesus through the lens of the type of person that they want their community to understand Jesus to be. So the idea of the Gospels being kind of stepping back, scholar, kind of just looking at the brute facts, that's a modern invention. Nothing in the ancient world was what we would consider an unbiased biography. What Mark innovates, though, is to create the gospel genre that combines the deeds of Christ with the teachings into a single narrative. We know that there was some other source that was floating around that would have just had Christ's teachings in it. And I'll get to that a little bit later. And then we have the genre of the bios that didn't get into teachings much, but it was a description of the life of someone. Mark mashes those two things together, both the life of Christ and the teachings of Christ, into a single work. That is what the gospel is. The early church saw the Gospels as memoirs of the apostles. That's the way that they were titled before they became the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, right? They were seen as the memoirs, the stories that the apostles passed down about Christ. Interestingly, the Gospels, it seems, from their beginning, were written in codices, so the ancient equivalent to a book, not a scroll. What this means is that they were not seen originally as formal literary compositions. If something was a formal literary composition, an important document, it would have been turned into a scroll. The fact that it was in a codex meant that these were seen to be more like educational handbooks. So these were practical documents, not just narratives. As a composition, these probably would have been read out loud to churches, right? Because not that many people were literate. And at first, they would have just been read beginning to end. So when I was in seminary, the professor that I took a seminar on the Gospel of Luke with, he made us every week, at least once a week, read the Gospel of Luke from beginning to end in one sitting, to understand that for its first audience, it would have been consumed at once. It was to be read from beginning to end as one oral narrative. As time went on, the Gospels would come to then just be read in chunks, right? Kind of like what we do in church today. Individual stories, individual pieces. So in modern terms, if we want to ask then, so what is the genre of gospel? I would say it's somewhere between a modern biography and a modern sermon. So that's the way to think of it. It's not completely disinterested, right? It has an argument. It wants to portray Jesus as a certain type of person, but it's not completely exhortative, right? It is conveying the life of Christ, right? The actual teachings of Christ. It's supposed to be applied. It's a handbook for Christian life. So it's somewhere between a biography and a sermon. As you read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're going to notice that more than just telling the same story of the same person, there are parts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that use the exact same words. So, not just the same event, but described in the exact same way, with the same literary asides, with the same turns of phrase. Not so much in John. John's kind of doing his own thing. But scholars look at this and they say, that doesn't sound like anything that we would expect three different people to produce, even talking about the same event. You don't use the same exact words to describe the same event, even if it is the same event. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the ancient times have been called the Synoptic Gospels, which means they are viewed together. What scholars have discerned through literary analysis is that both Matthew and Luke are later compositions, and we know this from Luke, right? Luke admits it, that he is using sources to try to present a full narrative. Clearly, Mark is very early. It has very rough Greek. It seems to not have the same rhetorical flourishes. It's really kind of to the point. It does make sense that Mark was viewed as, scribbled down notes from Peter teaching, and Mark is his scribe going, oh, that's good, I got to get that down, right? So both Matthew and Luke use Mark as their base text. So Mark is this kind of first layer, and Matthew and Luke take Mark for their own communities and augment it with other sources and other stories. If you look at the handout on the back, you can see what's called the four-source hypothesis, which is currently the majority scholarly opinion dealing with the synoptic problem. And as best we can tell, because both Matthew and Luke have some teachings of Jesus that are not present in Mark, but also use almost the exact same words, and not just the words of Christ, but the surrounding words as well, that are kind of narration. It's hypothesized that those come from a document that contained just a bunch of the sayings of Jesus that's been lost to us. It's a hypothetical. It's not like there was some single document, but we know that there is something written down, or some groups of things that were written down, that both Matthew and Luke used to augment the story in Mark. As a note, that gets what's called Q. Q from the first letter of the German word for source. And Q just means that it comes from some shared thing that had been written down that both Matthew and Luke are looking at. And then there's a few things that are just in Matthew and a few things that are just in Luke. And you can see those are just noted with, well, it comes from M, right? Just the stuff that's in Matthew that's not anywhere else we call M. So that might have been written down somewhere. It could be like a true previous source. Or that could just be Matthew going around and asking, like, okay, do you remember that Jesus said? Same thing with Luke, right? We know that that's what Luke did, right? Because he tells us at the beginning of Luke, he says, I've done a bunch of research, this is what I found. So really, both Matthew and Luke, for their Gospels, are early Christians writing research papers, okay? Mark, in the Christian tradition, is someone that knew St. Peter writing down notes about what Peter was teaching in Rome before his death. John does not share Mark as its base text. So whatever we see in John are traditions of Christ from an independent source or an independent literary tradition. Let's move to Matthew's Gospel in particular. So Matthew's Gospel was probably the second Gospel to be written down after Mark, and it dates likely from the 80s AD. Right, so if we think that Mark probably was written down shortly after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70, Matthew was probably written, less than 10 years after. We know that Matthew gets a pretty wide read because it's referenced by name in lots of early Christian, early church father writings. So by 130 AD, right? So really just after Christianity takes its first steps as a not denomination of Judaism, Matthew is being referenced by the church fathers as one of the Gospels. So very early influence. All of the Gospels in their manuscripts are anonymous, right? Unlike the letters of Paul, right? It doesn't say, Matthew to the church at blank, greetings. No, there's no heading, right? The manuscript does not associate it with any author. It's church tradition that assigns the Gospels to their authors. So just like it's church tradition that tells us what is a book in the Bible and what isn't, church tradition is what tells us, this was written by a guy named Matthew. The reason that church tradition says that, and this is really interesting, it's because in Mark's Gospel, the tax collector that Jesus calls is named Levi. In Matthew's Gospel, the tax collector that Jesus calls is named Matthew. And the church goes, Why would he change that name? Maybe that's kind of the authorial insertion, like a painter painting his face into a fresco. So this was written by someone named Matthew, who might have been a tax collector, which is why he inserted himself into that point in the story. But the fact that he changes that name from Mark's gospel to his own leads some in the church tradition to say, oh, it was written by someone named Matthew. So just interesting. However, and this is important, the fact that the author of Matthew is so reliant on Mark's gospel and on a source that was clearly previously written down for Christ's teachings makes it pretty unlikely that Matthew was a direct witness to the ministry of Christ. It is most likely that the author of Mark, Matthew, and Luke are in that second generation of Christians, taking what was the oral teachings of the apostles and things that had previously been written down and compiling them. It's still an open question whether John was actually written by Saint John, the actual direct disciple of Jesus, or one of John's students after hearing John speak. But that's kind of a more likely direct scenario than any of the three Synoptic Gospels. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's look at some of the themes in Matthew before we break out into discussion about the content. So, what is the type of Jesus that Matthew's giving us? So, Matthew is presenting Jesus as the prophesied Jewish Messiah. Matthew is trying to bring out, through the way that he's crafting his gospel, Jesus' status as the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament, of all Jewish prophecy. This is why it's placed first in the New Testament, because that was Matthew's type, Matthew's theme. It forms a really coherent bridge between the prophetic books in the Old Testament and the story of Jesus in the New Testament. So right from the beginning, the genealogy of Jesus stresses, right, that he is the son of Abraham, so one of God's chosen people, and then the son of David. So he is the promised king. You contrast this with Luke, and Luke focuses a lot more on how Jesus is the savior of all people, including the Gentiles. Luke's gospel says, oh, Jesus goes all the way back to Adam, right? So the progenitor of all the people. But because Matthew is so focused on Jesus' status as the Hebrew, he's only going back to Abraham, and he is specific to mention that Jesus is the son of David, the king to come. Matthew's gospel says over and over again that some action or saying of Jesus was to fulfill a prophecy, right? Sometimes he actually lists the prophecy from the prophetic book in the Old Testament. Sometimes he doesn't. It just says this was meant to fulfill as it has been written. Some things are easy to figure out where he's pointing to. Some of those references have been lost to us, so we don't know exactly what Matthew was thinking. So clearly there are some interpretations of the Hebrew scriptures in the first century that would have been clear to Matthew's audience that have been lost to us, because we just don't conceive of the Old Testament and interpret it in the same way. So there's a handful of places in Matthew's gospel where it says this was done to fulfill the prophecy, and we go, we have no idea what you're talking about. So just, if you were a little bit lost about, well, what prophecy is he talking about? You're not alone. We just don't know. Some things have just been lost to the tide of history. But what this is showing us, though, is Matthew was probably written for a majority Jewish Christian audience. So this would not have been written for a majority Gentile Christian audience. The focus is really about Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. Some ancient scholars conjecture that maybe this was originally written in Hebrew for that reason. modern scholarship has kind of pushed that aside because most of what we see rhetorically would not make sense if it had originally been written in Hebrew. The Greek is Greek turns of phrase, Greek formatting. So it is a Greek document for a Jewish Christian audience. The second major theme in Matthew is that Jesus is shown to be the personification of the Torah. So in John's Gospel, he says, there was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. John just comes out and says it, right? In Matthew's Gospel, it's the same idea, right? That the Word of God, part of which was written down in the Torah, has become alive in Jesus, right? Jesus is what the Torah was pointing to. Matthew highlights Jesus' teaching ministry more than any other gospel. What I mean by that is that when you look at the percentage of verses in Matthew, a larger percentage of Matthew's gospel is taken up by Christ's direct teaching than a percentage of any other gospel. Matthew's gospel is divided into 5 major discourses, and you see that on your handout too. I kind of broke it up. Scholars conjecture that Matthew structured it in 5 major teaching sections to mimic the 5 books of the Torah. So just as the Torah of the Hebrews has 5 sections, well, in Matthew's gospel, the teaching of Jesus, the personification of the Torah, has 5 sections. But remember, Jesus also reworks a lot of the Torah, like I talked about in Sunday's sermon, right? Jesus clarifies, Jesus intensifies. Sometimes Jesus kind of pushes aside some of the things that the Torah commands. But because there's this sense that Jesus is the Word of God in the flesh, this is where we get that radical discipleship. Jesus says, if you want to be perfect, follow me, right? Remember the conversation with a person that comes up and asks him, Rabbi, what must I do to be perfect? Follow the commandments, right? He points him to the Torah. He says, I already do that. Okay, if you want to be perfect, follow me, right? Because Jesus is the Torah made flesh, the Word of God made flesh. The third major theme in Matthew's gospel this one is pretty unique to Matthew's gospel, is church leadership. So remember, the gospels were written, at least Matthew and Luke, they're a bit later than Mark's. The churches are more than just kind of a ragtag group. They've begun to be a little bit more established, concentrated in an urban area. They're starting to get, in Paul's letters early on, there's that sense of hierarchy where you had some people set aside as deacons, some people called presbyter bishops, elder bishops that are in oversight. So Matthew's gospel is, 20 years after Paul's letter. So that structural aspect of the church had grown even more. So the church is becoming more hierarchical, more institutionalized, because we're moving from that first generation of disciples into the second generation of disciples. Matthew is the only gospel to use the Greek word ekklesia, which is what we translate today as the church, right? So by the time Matthew was written, there was a coherent idea of the church already, not just the way, not just the followers, but the church. Matthew is also where we find Jesus' response to Peter's confession of him as the Christ, where Jesus says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and then gives Peter the power of the keys. We also see in Matthew's gospel Christ's directions for disciplining members of the church leading up to possible excommunication. So that's in Matthew's gospel. Like I said, Matthew's gospel is the origin of the doctrine of the keys. And this is an important thing for us to read as Christians today because it gets assumed, this idea, into so much of church history. So in Matthew 16, during that exchange between Peter and Christ, Peter is given the keys of the kingdom, the power to bind and loose on earth, with the promise that what he binds and looses on earth, God will do so in heaven. This promise is also extended to all the other apostles 2 chapters later. Right? So what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So the idea of binding and loosing is talking about the ability of someone to either impose a religious obligation or to withdraw a religious obligation. So this is closely linked with the ability to forgive sins and also the option to withhold forgiveness of sins. So remember, in John's gospel later on, Jesus tells them, if you forgive someone's sins, they're forgiven. But if you, the leaders of the church, decide not to forgive someone's sins, they're not forgiven. The idea to bind and loose, where the root comes in, and this is true for all of Matthew's gospel, is the idea that the church is a continuation of the same ministry that Christ started. So we see several times this comes up. Christ is shown to have the power to exorcise demons and heal diseases. Then the apostles are sent out with the power to exorcise demons and heal diseases. Christ claims for himself the divine prerogative to forgive sins. Then he sends the disciples and says, you have the ability to forgive sins. Christ binds his followers in some ways. You've heard that it was said, you shall not, or take an eye for an eye, but I tell you, don't even retaliate at all, right? Turn the other cheek. So that's binding, that's a higher standard. But Christ also looses the requirements of the law in some others, right? The man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. So what we see is that the church can now impose rules on its people and loose them from certain requirements. This ends up getting put into action in the book of Acts when we see the apostles vote that Gentiles who become part of the faith do not have to follow the law of Moses. Right? They just vote. They decide. They use that power to say, you are not bound by the law of Moses. But they do say, what you are bound by is that you can't eat food with blood in it. Right? We also see this in church history, that the church binds us when it says, these are the books that are in Scripture. Right? It has the power to say, these are your standards. Also, when it imposes penance on people who ask for forgiveness. Right? You say, you're forgiven, but you have a religious obligation to do this to make some good in the world. So you see the way that the idea of the church having the authority to forgive sins and to bind and loose, that is with this idea that what Jesus does is then conveyed to the church. Okay, so what are our takeaways from Matthew? Like all narratives in the Bible, the Gospels are written to specific communities and tell the story of Jesus in ways that will be meaningful and powerful to those people. For Matthew, that was a group of Jewish Christians. That means that he constructs his gospel in a way that they can see Jesus as the Messiah, the successor to Moses, the Torah in the flesh. For Matthew, following Jesus is a totalizing commitment, specifically because Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. So just like the law of Moses touched on every part of life, so too then does following Jesus mean that every part of life is going to be affected. Third, the church, for Matthew, is given a great amount of authority and discretion to apply the gospel in real time and contextualize it as needed. When you think in church history, when it seems like the church changes the rules, right? So in Paul, we see that Paul says, if you're a woman and you're in church, you need to have your head covered. Well, the church decided to loose that rule, right? The rules changed. That's rooted in this grant by Jesus to say, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's all I got for you. We will transition. Have a good time.